This is a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you are watching from. It is always fascinating to see how far these stories can reach. The winter of 1903 came early to Garfield County, Montana. By mid-October, the prairies surrounding the township of Jordan had already seen 3 significant snowfalls, and the temperature rarely climbed above freezing. It was the kind of winter that made people stay inside, that made communities turn inward, that made asking too many questions seem less important than survival. In this environment, certain things could go unnoticed longer than they should have. Aldis Kern arrived in Jordan sometime in late September of that year. The exact date remains unclear, as no official records document his arrival. What is known comes primarily from testimony given decades later, collected by a researcher named Dr. Virgil Ashton in 1964, when he was compiling an oral history of frontier commerce in eastern Montana. Dr. Ashton's interviews, archived at the Montana Historical Society until 1968, contain references to events that, at first glance, appear mundane. It is only upon closer examination that certain patterns emerge. According to Leander Pruitt, who operated the general store in Jordan at the time, Kern presented himself as a meat supplier with connections to ranches in the Musselshell River Valley, approximately 70 miles west. Pruitt described him as a man of average height, perhaps 45 years of age, with a peculiar stillness in his manner of speaking. He didn't hurry his words, Pruitt told Dr. Ashton. Most men who come through trying to sell something, they talk quick, like they're afraid you'll say no before they finish. Kern just stood there, waiting, like he already knew what you'd say. The timing of Kern's arrival coincided with a difficult period for the community. The spring roundup had been poor, and several established suppliers had raised their prices substantially. When Kern offered quality cuts at rates below market value, store owners throughout the county began placing orders. Within 3 weeks, his meat appeared on tables throughout Jordan, Malta, and the smaller settlements dotting the Missouri River breaks. Contemporary records from the Jordan Tribune make passing reference to Kern's business in their commercial notices section. An advertisement from October 15, 1903, reads, "Fresh provisions available at Pruitt's General Store. Quality guaranteed. Inquire within." What is notable about these advertisements is their brevity and lack of specific detail about the type or source of meat being sold. The first documented concern appears in a letter dated November 3, 1903, written by a woman named Cordelia Vance to her sister in Helena. The letter, discovered among family papers donated to the Montana Historical Society in 1967, contains a passage that Dr. Ashton would later identify as significant. "The meat Jasper brought home last week troubled me. The grain of it seemed wrong somehow, and though it cooked well enough, there was an unfamiliar sweetness to it that I cannot place." When I asked Mr. Pruitt about its origin, he became quite short with me and said only that the supplier was reliable. I have since fed it to the hogs. Jasper Vance, Cordelia's husband, worked as a ranch hand on the Kettleman spread, one of the larger operations in the county. According to employment records preserved at the Garfield County Courthouse, the Kettleman Ranch maintained a herd of approximately 800 head of cattle that year. It would seem unusual, then, that Jasper would need to purchase meat from town rather than receiving beef directly from his employer, as was customary. This detail appears in Cordelia's letter, but was apparently not considered significant at the time. By mid-November, Kern had established a regular delivery route. Every Tuesday and Friday, his wagon would arrive in Jordan before dawn, the bed loaded with parcels wrapped in brown paper and tied with hemp cord. Witnesses described the wagon as unremarkable, pulled by 2 draft horses of indeterminate breed. What struck several observers as odd was the consistent absence of any smell. Meat transport, especially in that era, typically produced a noticeable odor. Kern's deliveries produced none. Octavia Drummond, who kept a boarding house on Jordan's Main Street, mentioned this detail to Dr. Ashton during their 1964 interview. "I remember thinking it strange that you couldn't smell anything when he passed. Even wrapped tight, meat has a scent to it. His packages had no smell at all until you opened them. And even then it was faint, like it had been washed too many times." The question of what Kern delivered becomes more complex when examining accounts from those who worked with the meat regularly. Pruitt, the store owner, told Dr. Ashton that he never actually saw Kern prepare or butcher anything. He'd bring it in already portioned. Perfect cuts every time, no waste. In 20 years running that store, I never saw anyone work meat that clean. There was never any trim, never any bone unless you specifically ordered it, never any fat beyond what belonged there. It was almost too perfect. The word almost appears frequently in accounts from this period. Almost too perfect, almost familiar, almost right. These qualifiers suggest an underlying discomfort that witnesses struggle to articulate directly. On December 7, 1903, a trapper named Cyprian Oakes reported to the county sheriff that he had not been able to locate several of his trap lines in the Wolf Creek drainage, approximately 15 miles northeast of Jordan. The lines had been set in early November and should have been easy to relocate using the blazes he had marked on the surrounding ponderosa pines. According to the brief notation in the sheriff's log, Oakes stated that something had disturbed the area extensively, though I could not determine what. The ground appeared to have been worked over, but not by any animal I recognize. Sheriff's records from Garfield County during this period are sparse. The sheriff at the time, a man named Vernon Halleck, maintained only minimal documentation. What remains suggests he did not consider Oakes's report worthy of investigation. The notation ends with, "Advised Mr. Oakes that winter conditions often make trapline recovery difficult." The same week, a ranch hand employed by the Mathers family discovered a cache of what he initially believed to be animal remains in a coulee near the Musselshell River. The discovery was mentioned in passing in a letter from Dalton Mathers to a business associate, now part of the Montana Historical Society's Agricultural Correspondence Collection. Mathers wrote, "Our man Hodges came across something unsettling in the south pasture, a considerable pile of bones and such, though he could not determine what manner of creature they came from. The pieces were wrong somehow. We burned it all to be safe and moved the herd north for the winter." Neither Oakes's report nor the Mathers discovery were connected to Kern's business at the time. There was no reason to connect them. Unexplained findings were not uncommon in frontier territory, and most received rational explanations or were simply forgotten. Throughout December, Kern continued his deliveries without incident. Orders remained steady. By all accounts, his meat sold well, and no one reported illness or dissatisfaction with the product itself. What began to trouble certain members of the community was not the meat, but rather the growing difficulty in determining exactly what it was. A butcher named Quintus Farrow, who had operated a shop in Malta for 12 years, received several orders of Kern's meat through wholesale channels. In a diary entry dated December 19, 1903, later transcribed by his granddaughter and submitted to Dr. Ashton, Farrow wrote, "Examined 3 parcels from the new Supplier today. The meat is well marbled and of excellent color, but I confess I cannot determine the cut with certainty. The muscle structure does not correspond to beef, though the grain is similar. It is not pork, as the fat is wrong. Venison has been suggested, but the tissue is too fine." When I asked Kern directly about his source, he smiled and said only that he worked with what was available. I found the answer unsatisfying, but could not press further without appearing rude. It is worth noting that Farrow was not an inexperienced tradesman. His diary contains detailed observations about meat quality, butchering techniques, and livestock assessment that demonstrate considerable expertise. His inability to identify Kern's product with confidence is therefore significant. On December 28, 1903, a homesteader named Lucretia Marsh filed a missing persons report with Sheriff Halleck. Her husband, Abner Marsh, had left their claim northeast of Jordan 6 days earlier to check trap lines and had not returned. The sheriff's notation is brief. Will investigate when weather permits. Area currently impassable due to snow accumulation. The Marsh claim was located in the same general region where Cyprian Oaks had reported disturbed ground 3 weeks earlier. This proximity was not remarked upon in any official documentation. Abner Marsh, age 38, was known as a capable outdoorsman who had survived multiple Montana winters without incident. His failure to return was particularly troubling because he had left with adequate provisions for a week and was familiar with every mile of the territory surrounding his claim. Local residents considered him reliable and experienced, not the type to get lost or make fatal errors of judgment. His wife reported that his winter clothing, rifle, and survival gear were all missing from their cabin, suggesting he had prepared appropriately for his journey, yet he simply vanished, leaving no trace that search parties could find even weeks later when weather permitted investigation. Between November 1903 and February 1904, at least 6 individuals were reported missing in Garfield County and the surrounding area. Besides Abner Marsh, the list included a traveling salesman named Gerard Finch, who had been making his regular circuit between Malta and Jordan, a ranch hand named Delbert Cole, who disappeared while riding between 2 sections of the Mathers Ranch, a widow named Vera Stanton, who set out from her homestead to visit relatives in Jordan and never arrived, a prospector known only as Old Dutch, who worked claims along the Missouri River breaks, and a sheepherder named Rufus Webb, who vanished along with approximately 40 head of sheep from his flock. Each disappearance occurred in isolation, separated by enough time and distance that patterns were not immediately obvious. Each could be explained individually by the harsh conditions, accidents, or simple misfortune. Only in retrospect, when examined collectively, did the cluster of disappearances become statistically unusual for even a harsh Montana winter. By early January 1904, certain members of the Jordan community had begun to express private concerns about Kern. These concerns were not voiced publicly and did not appear in any formal complaints, but they emerge in personal correspondence and diary entries examined by Dr. Ashton during his research. Leander Pruitt's ledger, preserved at the Montana Historical Society, shows a subtle but noticeable change in ordering patterns beginning in January. While Kern's deliveries continued, several regular customers ceased purchasing meat from Pruitt's store entirely, despite no apparent alternative source being available in the area. When Dr. Ashton interviewed Pruitt about this pattern in 1964, the former storekeeper was reluctant to elaborate. Some people just stopped buying meat for a while, he said they were getting by on beans and preserved goods. I didn't ask why. On January 14, 1904, Sheriff Halleck led a small party to search for Abner Marsh. The weather had cleared sufficiently to allow travel into the Wolf Creek drainage. According to the sheriff's report, filed January 18th, the party found Marsh's horse wandering loose approximately 12 miles from his home claim. The animal appeared well fed but showed signs of stress. No trace of Marsh himself was discovered despite 3 days of searching. The report concludes, presumed loss to exposure. Body may be recovered when snow melts. Abner Marsh's disappearance did not initially generate significant concern beyond his immediate family. Men vanished in frontier territory with some regularity, victims of weather, accident, or simple misfortune. What is notable in retrospect is the timing and location of several other similar incidents during the same winter. Records maintained by the Montana Territory Surveyor General archived in Helena until their transfer to the State Archives in 1965, indicate that between November 1903 and February 1904, at least 6 individuals were reported missing in Garfield County and the surrounding area. This represented an unusual concentration of disappearances for a sparsely populated region. The Surveyor General's office noted the pattern in a routine territorial report, but offered no explanation beyond the obvious hazards of winter travel. The pattern might have remained unremarked, except for a letter written on February 3, 1904, by Father Matthias Brennan, the Catholic priest serving the circuit that included Jordan and several smaller settlements. The letter was addressed to Bishop John Brondel in Helena and was filed among diocesan correspondence later donated to the Montana Historical Society. In it, Father Brennan expressed concern about a spiritual malaise affecting his congregation. Several members of my flock have confessed to me troubling dreams and a sense of unease they cannot articulate, Father Brennan wrote. When pressed for details, they speak of a feeling that something in their homes is not right, though they can identify nothing specific. More troubling is that several families have ceased attending services entirely, offering only vague excuses. One woman told me she could not bear to take communion because she feared she had participated in something wrong, though she would not explain what she meant by this. Father Brennan's letter does not mention Kern or the meat supply directly, but the timing of his observations corresponds with the period of Kern's most active business in the area. The priest concluded his letter by requesting permission to conduct a series of special services focused on spiritual cleansing, which the bishop apparently approved, though no record of these services appears in parish records. On February 11, 1904, Quintus Farrow, the Malta butcher, traveled to Jordan specifically to speak with Leander Pruitt. No record of their conversation exists, but Farrow's diary entry from that evening states, "Met with Pruitt today regarding our shared concern. We have agreed to cease dealing with Kern. Neither of us can articulate precisely why, but we are in accord that something is profoundly wrong. Pruitt will inform Kern that his services are no longer required. I expect he will not react well to this news." The following day, Pruitt's general store burned to the ground. The fire started sometime after midnight and consumed the entire structure before assistance could arrive. Pruitt and his family escaped without serious injury, but the store and all its contents were destroyed. The cause of the fire was officially listed as unknown, possibly lamp-related, according to records at the Garfield County Courthouse. In the days following the fire, Kern ceased his regular deliveries. Several witnesses reported seeing his wagon leave Jordan on the morning of February 13th, heading south toward the Missouri River. He was never seen in the area again. The matter might have ended there, remembered only as an unfortunate incident followed by a supplier's departure, except for events that unfolded in March of 1904. On March 9th, following an unusually warm week that caused rapid snowmelt throughout the region, a survey crew working in the Wolf Creek drainage discovered human remains. The remains were scattered over an area of approximately 30 yards and appeared to have been disturbed by scavengers. What immediately struck the survey crew as unusual was the condition of the remains. According to their report, submitted to the county sheriff on March 12th, the bones showed evidence of systematic processing that was inconsistent with animal predation. Sheriff Halleck traveled to the site and conducted a brief examination. His report, filed March 14th, is notable for its clinical detachment. Human remains discovered by survey crew. Skeleton incomplete. Evidence suggests extended exposure to elements. Cannot determine identity or cause of termination. Area shows signs of previous human activity of unknown purpose. Additional search of surrounding area yielded several similar remains at various states of preservation. Total count uncertain. Appears to be a disposal site of some kind. The sheriff's report makes no mention of the connection between the discovery site and the area where Cyprian Oaks had reported disturbed ground the previous December, though the locations were less than 2 miles apart. Nor does it reference the disappearance of Abner Marsh, whose last known location placed him in the same general vicinity. What the report does include is a brief notation about other findings at the site. Discovered multiple areas of disturbed earth suggesting recent excavation. Also found several items of possible evidential value, including rope, tools consistent with butchering or processing, and wrapped parcels buried in shallow pits. Parcels contained prepared meat portions of uncertain origin. Due to advanced decomposition, material has been burned per standard sanitation protocol. The wrapped parcels mentioned in the report were described in slightly more detail in Sheriff Halleck's personal notes, which were not made public but were later accessed by Dr. Ashton during his research. According to these notes, the parcels were wrapped in brown paper and tied with hemp cord, identical to the packaging used by Kern for his deliveries. Each parcel had been buried approximately 18 inches below the surface, arranged in a rough grid pattern suggesting systematic storage. The parcels varied in size, but most were consistent with standard meat portions of 10 to 15 pounds. The sheriff apparently recognized this similarity, but chose not to emphasize it in his official report. His private notes include an observation that the packaging method and materials are consistent with commercial meat supply operations common in the territory. Why he omitted this potentially significant detail from his official documentation remains unclear. Some historians have suggested he wished to avoid implicating local businesses without definitive proof. Others have proposed that political considerations influenced his decision, given the potential impact such accusations might have on the community's economy and reputation. On March 18, 1904, Sheriff Halleck and a deputy traveled to several locations in Garfield County to conduct interviews related to the remains discovered at Wolf Creek. Among those interviewed was Leander Pruitt, who had been temporarily staying with relatives following the destruction of his store. According to a summary note in the sheriff's file, Pruitt provided information regarding the activities of a meat supplier named Aldis Kern, who had conducted business in the area from approximately October 1903 through February 1904. Mr. Pruitt expressed concerns about the origin of Mr. Kern's products, but could provide no definitive evidence of wrongdoing, stated that Kern departed the area following the fire at his establishment and has not been seen since. The sheriff's investigation yielded no conclusive results. In a report filed with the county commissioners on April 2, 1904, Halleck summarized his findings. Investigation into the discovery of human remains in Wolf Creek drainage has been unable to establish definitive connection between said remains and any specific individual or incident. While suspicious circumstances exist, including the disappearance of several persons during the winter months and the activities of a transient merchant, insufficient evidence exists to support formal charges. The matter is considered unresolved pending additional information. No additional information ever emerged. Aldis Kern was never located. The remains discovered at Wolf Creek were never positively identified, though local speculation connected them to several of the individuals reported missing during the winter. Abner Marsh's body was never recovered. The other missing persons were similarly never found. In the months following these events, the community of Jordan gradually returned to normal patterns of life. Pruitt rebuilt his store on the same location, though he never again dealt with independent meat suppliers, choosing instead to order directly from established wholesalers in Billings. Quintus Farrow continued his butcher shop in Malta without incident. Father Brennan's spiritual malaise apparently resolved itself, as his subsequent correspondence to the bishop makes no further mention of unusual confessional material or absent parishioners. The matter might have remained a local mystery, known only to those directly involved, except for Dr. Virgil Ashton's research project 6 decades later. Dr. Ashton, a historian specializing in frontier commerce, was conducting interviews throughout eastern Montana for a comprehensive study of territorial trade patterns. It was during these interviews that he began to notice references to the events of 1903-1904. Dr. Ashton's research notes, archived at the Montana Historical Society following his death in 1968, reveal a man gradually becoming aware of a disturbing pattern. His initial interviews focused on standard commercial history, but as he spoke with more elderly residents who had lived through the territorial period, certain stories kept emerging. References to the meat supplier, or that winter, appeared in multiple accounts, always accompanied by a reluctance to discuss specifics. In a letter to a colleague dated August 1964, Dr. Ashton wrote, "I have encountered something unexpected in my research. Multiple sources reference a commercial operation in Garfield County circa 1903 that appears to have been connected to suspicious disappearances and the discovery of human remains. The official records are sparse and inconclusive, but the oral testimony is remarkably consistent in describing a sense of something profoundly wrong. What troubles me most is that many of these sources are reluctant to speak openly, even 60 years after the fact, as if there remained some community shame or fear associated with the events." Dr. Ashton spent the next 3 years attempting to piece together a complete account of what occurred. He tracked down descendants of key figures, examined county records, reviewed territorial reports, and collected dozens of interviews. His notes reveal a methodical researcher increasingly disturbed by what he was uncovering. In his personal journal, Dr. Ashton recorded observations that did not make it into his formal research. An entry dated November 1965 states, "Met today with the granddaughter of Leander Pruitt. She was reluctant to discuss her grandfather's involvement with Kern, but eventually shared a disturbing detail. Pruitt apparently kept a private record of his concerns about the meat supplier separate from his business ledgers. This record was destroyed by Pruitt himself in 1904, shortly after the Wolf Creek discovery. According to his granddaughter, Pruitt told his family that certain knowledge was better not preserved. What could have been in that record that so troubled him?" Another journal entry, dated January 1966, spoke with Octavia Drummond's nephew who inherited her boarding house property. "He showed me the cellar where food storage occurred during the territorial period. A section of the cellar wall contains scratched markings that appear to be a tally or count of some kind." The nephew said his aunt never used that section of the cellar after 1904 and actually had it walled off in 1911. When I asked why, he said she told him she couldn't bear to look at what had been kept there. I am beginning to understand that whatever occurred in Jordan during that winter affected the community in ways that persisted long after the immediate events concluded. Dr. Ashton's most significant discovery came in March 1967, when he obtained access to sealed county records that had been transferred from the old courthouse to new facilities in a neighboring county. Among these records was an addendum to Sheriff Halleck's Wolf Creek investigation, filed in July 1904, but apparently never made public. The addendum describes additional remains discovered during summer road work approximately 8 miles from the original Wolf Creek site. According to the document, workers encountered extensive evidence of previous excavation and disposal activities while grading a new wagon road through a remote coulee. The remains were described as numerous and in various states of preservation, suggesting extended use of the location for disposal purposes. What made this discovery particularly significant was a detail Halleck included in his description of the site. Found multiple parcels similar to those discovered at Wolf Creek location, also recovered several implements consistent with butchering operations, including blades, hooks, and processing equipment. Most notably discovered a ledger or record book buried in oiled cloth. Book contains columns of notations that appear to be dates, quantities, and possibly monetary figures, though specifics are difficult to determine due to damage. Several entries correlate to approximate dates of known disappearances in the region. The ledger itself was not included with the addendum and has never been located. Sheriff Halleck's notes indicate he forwarded it to territorial authorities in Helena, but no record of its receipt exists in territorial archives. Dr. Ashton's attempts to trace the document proved unsuccessful. In a draft chapter of his unfinished manuscript about Jordan's commercial history, Dr. Ashton synthesized his findings. The available evidence suggests that Aldis Kern operated a systematic enterprise in Garfield County during the winter of 1903–1904 that exploited the isolation of frontier settlement and the vulnerability of individuals traveling alone in harsh conditions. While direct proof remains elusive, the circumstantial evidence is compelling. Multiple disappearances occurred in a concentrated time frame. Human remains were discovered at locations that corresponded to areas where Kern was known to travel. The remains showed evidence of systematic processing. Kern's meat products could not be definitively identified by experienced butchers, and Kern's departure from the area coincided precisely with the decision of local merchants to cease doing business with him, followed immediately by the fire at Pruitt's store. Dr. Ashton continued, "What may be most disturbing is not what Kern did, but the community's response to growing suspicions. Multiple sources suggest that concerns about Kern's products emerged relatively early in his time in Jordan, yet he continued to operate for months. This suggests a collective reluctance to confront what people feared might be true. In a harsh winter, with limited food sources and high prices, people appear to have made a choice to not look too closely at what they were being offered. The shame associated with this choice may explain the decades-long silence about these events." Dr. Ashton's research methodology involved cross-referencing multiple independent sources to establish timelines and verify facts. He examined territorial records, county documents, church registers, personal correspondence, newspaper archives, and conducted extensive oral history interviews. His notes reveal a researcher who became increasingly convinced of a disturbing truth, but who struggled with the ethical implications of publicizing his conclusions without absolute proof. In one particularly revealing journal entry from December 1967, he wrote, "I find myself in an uncomfortable position. The evidence points overwhelmingly toward a conclusion that is almost too terrible to articulate. Yet I cannot definitively prove what I believe occurred. As a historian, I am trained to work with incomplete evidence, to draw reasonable conclusions from available materials. But this case demands more than reasonable conclusions. It demands certainty that I cannot provide. Do I have the right to accuse a man even posthumously of crimes I cannot prove? Do I have the right to drag a community's long-buried shame into public view? These are not merely academic questions. They touch on fundamental issues of historical responsibility and the purpose of historical inquiry itself." The manuscript was never completed. Dr. Virgil Ashton died in April 1968, officially of a heart attack at his home in Missoula. His research materials were donated to the Montana Historical Society as per his will, but significant portions of his work on the Jordan case appear to be missing. The inventory of his papers, compiled by the Historical Society in 1969, notes, "Materials related to Dr. Ashton's research on Garfield County commercial history, approximately 1964–1967, appear incomplete. Expected documents, including interview transcripts, correspondence, and manuscript drafts for chapters 7 to 12, are not present in the collection. No explanation for these omissions has been determined." Dr. Ashton's colleague, Professor Emil Crow of the University of Montana, wrote in a memorial published in the Montana Historical Review in 1968, "Dr. Ashton's final research project appeared to trouble him deeply in ways that went beyond normal academic concern. In our last conversation, approximately 2 weeks before his death, he expressed regret about pursuing certain lines of inquiry and stated that some historical events are perhaps better left unexamined. This was uncharacteristic of a man who built his career on the principle that history must be confronted honestly, regardless of how uncomfortable it might be. I sensed in him a profound weariness that I had not seen before. The physical locations connected to these events have largely vanished. The site where Sheriff Halleck discovered remains in Wolf Creek drainage was flooded in 1953 by the construction of Fort Peck Dam, now lying beneath the waters of Fort Peck Lake. The second disposal site mentioned in Halleck's sealed addendum was never precisely documented and cannot be relocated. Pruitt's rebuilt general store operated until 1947 and was demolished in 1951 to make way for a gas station, which itself closed in 1979. The land is now vacant. Jordan itself remains a small community, still remote, still characterized by harsh winters and isolation. The population in 2020 was fewer than 400, not much larger than it was in 1904. No monument or marker references the events of 1903, 1904. Most current residents are unaware of the history entirely. The few who know of it learned through family stories passed down quietly, stories that are rarely, if ever, discussed openly. The town's official history, published for its centennial in 1996, makes no mention of Kern or the disappearances of that winter. This omission is notable, given the publication's otherwise comprehensive coverage of Jordan's early years. When contacted by a researcher in 2003 about this omission, the Centennial Book's editor stated only that certain historical matters were considered too sensitive or too poorly documented for inclusion. The editor declined to elaborate further. In recent decades, the story has occasionally surfaced in collections of Montana folklore and frontier mysteries, though typically in highly sensationalized or fictionalized form that bears little resemblance to the documented facts. These retellings often add supernatural elements or elaborate details that have no basis in historical record. The real story, as documented by Dr. Ashton's research and supported by archival materials, is disturbing enough without embellishment. It is a story of human vulnerability, economic desperation, and the terrible choices people can make when survival seems to require not looking too closely at uncomfortable truths. In 1989, a construction crew working on a county road project approximately 15 miles northeast of Jordan uncovered what appeared to be the remnants of an old campsite or work area. Among the debris were rusted tools, fragments of pottery, and several bones that were initially assumed to be animal remains. A cursory examination by the county coroner determined that some of the bones were human, though their age could not be precisely established. The discovery was reported to the sheriff's office, which conducted a brief investigation and concluded that the remains were likely quite old and possibly connected to the frontier period. No further action was taken. The Montana Historical Society maintains a research file on the 1903-1904 Garfield County disappearances, though it is not prominently cataloged and is rarely accessed. The file contains Sheriff Halleck's reports, selected correspondence from Dr. Ashton's research, and a few newspaper clippings from the Jordan Tribune. A note attached to the file by an unknown archivist states, "Case appears to be an example of suspected criminal activity during territorial period that was never conclusively resolved. Limited evidence and the passage of time make definitive historical analysis impossible. What remains are questions that cannot be definitively answered. How many individuals actually disappeared during that winter? The official count of 6 may be incomplete, as not all disappearances in frontier territory were formally reported, particularly if the missing person had no family to file reports. What was the true extent of Kern's activities? Did they begin before his arrival in Jordan And did they continue after his departure? How much did the community know or suspect, and when did they know it? The evidence suggests some level of awareness developed early, but the extent of that awareness remains unclear. Why did the investigation conclude so abruptly? Sheriff Halleck's minimal effort might be explained by incompetence or political considerations, but the rapidity with which the case was closed suggests something more deliberate. What happened to the missing ledger that Sheriff Halleck reportedly forwarded to territorial authorities? Its disappearance is too convenient to be coincidental, yet no evidence of deliberate destruction has ever emerged. And what became of Aldis Kern himself? Regarding Kern's fate, speculation has never yielded results. No subsequent records of his existence have been located. He did not surface in other Montana communities, at least not under that name. Census records from subsequent years contain no matching entries. Death certificates filed in Montana Territory during the years following 1904 include no one matching his description. Military records, prison records, asylum records, all were checked by Dr. Ashton without result. He appears to have simply ceased to exist after leaving Jordan in February 1904. This complete absence of records is itself unusual. Even in the frontier period, most people left some documentary trace, however minimal. Kern's absolute absence from subsequent records suggests either a deliberate effort to disappear or the adoption of a new identity. If the latter, he was successful enough that no connection to his former identity has ever been established. The question of motive also remains open. If Kern did what the evidence suggests, why? Financial gain seems the obvious answer, but the profit margins on meat sales, even at his below-market prices, would hardly seem worth the enormous risk. Was there something else? Some pathology that went beyond economic considerations? Dr. Ashton, in his notes, speculated about this question, but reached no satisfying conclusion. The financial motive seems insufficient to explain the scale of what appears to have occurred, he wrote. If my interpretation is correct, Kern was not merely a criminal opportunist, but something far more disturbing. Yet understanding his motivations requires psychological insights that are impossible to develop at this historical distance and with such limited personal information about him. One final piece of information emerges from an unlikely source. In 1997, a woman named Sarah Kellerman donated a box of family papers to the Montana Historical Society. Among these papers was a letter dated November 1926, written by her grandfather, Thaddeus Kellerman, who had worked as a deputy sheriff in Phillips County during the 1920s. In the letter, addressed to a brother in North Dakota, Kellerman mentions a strange encounter. Was in Malta yesterday and ran into an old fellow at the train depot who gave me an odd feeling. Something in the way he looked at me like he was measuring me for something. I asked him if we'd met before, and he said maybe long ago, though he couldn't recall where. Said his name was Kern, and he was just passing through. Later, I remembered where I'd heard that name. Wasn't there a meat peddler by that name mixed up in some trouble down in Jordan years back, before my time in the Territory? Tried to find the fellow again before the train left, but he'd disappeared. Maybe it wasn't the same man. Would be quite old by now if it was. Still, the feeling stays with me. If Kellerman's encounter was indeed with the same Aldis Kern who operated in Jordan in 1903, 1904, it would place him in Montana 22 years after his disappearance from Garfield County. The implication is unsettling, suggesting that Kern may have continued his activities elsewhere, perhaps under different names, perhaps with more caution. But this is speculation built on a single ambiguous reference in a private letter, but it proves nothing. What can be established with reasonable certainty is that something disturbing occurred in Garfield County during the winter of 1903-1904. Multiple people vanished under circumstances that were never adequately explained. Human remains were discovered at locations that suggested systematic disposal. A meat supplier operated in the area during the precise period of these disappearances and provided products that experienced butchers could not identify. The supplier departed abruptly when questioned, and the community that purchased and consumed his products maintained a collective silence about the matter for decades afterward. The silence itself is perhaps the most revealing element. In frontier communities where everyone's business was generally known and gossip traveled quickly, the sustained absence of public discussion about these events is notable. It suggests a community-wide agreement to not speak of something, a collective decision that certain knowledge was too troubling to articulate. Father Brennan's reference to parishioners feeling they had participated in something wrong takes on additional significance in this context. The spiritual malaise he described may have been a manifestation of guilt, a collective understanding of what had occurred without the necessity of explicit acknowledgement. Communities can know things without speaking them aloud, and that unspoken knowledge can persist across generations. The descendants of those who lived through that winter in Jordan carry no personal memory of the events, yet some appear to carry an inherited unease. When Dr. Ashton conducted his interviews in the 1960s, several elderly residents expressed reluctance to discuss that time, even though they were children when it occurred or were born afterward. This suggests that families passed down not just stories, but also an injunction against speaking openly about what happened. Historical memory is selective. Communities choose what they preserve and what they allow to fade. The events in Jordan have been allowed to fade, remaining only in scattered archival documents, incomplete research files, and the occasional vague reference in local histories. There is no monument, no commemorative marker, no official acknowledgement that anything unusual occurred during that winter. The silence that began in 1904 has been largely maintained, yet the question persists. In a time of hardship and isolation, when a community faced difficult choices about survival, what boundaries might have been crossed? And once crossed, how does a community live with that knowledge? The people of Jordan in 1903-1904 found their answer in silence. Whether that silence represented wisdom or cowardice, protection or complicity, remains a matter of interpretation. The final word may belong to Dr. Virgil Ashton, who wrote in one of his last journal entries, dated February 1968, "I began this research believing that historical truth was always worth pursuing, that understanding the past, no matter how troubling, served an important purpose. I am no longer certain of that principle. Some truths do not enlighten, they only burden. The people of Jordan chose not to speak of what occurred during that winter, and in doing so, they may have been wiser than I initially believed. There are forms of knowledge that corrode the spirit, memories that poison the mind. I have come to understand why certain stories are deliberately forgotten, why some doors, once closed, should remain closed. I will not complete this manuscript. Some historical events should be allowed to rest in the silence that time provides." 2 months after writing those words, Dr. Ashton was dead. His unfinished manuscript remains unfinished. The story of Aldis Kern and the winter of 1903-1904 in Jordan, Montana, remains largely untold, preserved only in fragments, suggestions, and the uneasy spaces between documented facts. In the end, we are left with uncertainty. Did Aldis Kern systematically prey on isolated travelers during that harsh winter, processing their remains and selling the results to an unsuspecting community? Or is this merely a pattern imposed retrospectively on unrelated events by researchers looking for meaning in coincidence? The evidence suggests the former, but does not prove it conclusively. Perhaps that ambiguity is appropriate. Perhaps some questions are designed to remain unanswered, some mysteries are meant to persist, and some truths are better left in the silence of archives and the fading memories of those who chose not to speak. What we can say with certainty is this. During the winter of 1903-1904, in a remote corner of Montana Territory, something occurred that troubled the community deeply enough that they chose collective silence over public acknowledgement. That silence has largely held for more than a century. Whether it represents successful forgetting or carefully maintained concealment is impossible to determine at this distance. Both possibilities are equally unsettling. The remote prairie where these events unfolded continues its timeless cycles, indifferent to human concerns. Snow still falls early in that country. Winters are still harsh. People still vanish occasionally in that vast landscape, victims of weather or accident or simple bad luck. And in Jordan, in the rare moments when elderly residents gather and conversation turns to old times, there are still certain winters that are not discussed, certain names that are not mentioned, certain questions that remain politely unanswered. Some stories do not have conclusions. They simply stop, leaving behind only echoes and uncomfortable silences. The story of Aldis Kern is one of those. It stops in February 1904 with a meat supplier's departure from a small Montana town, and it remains stopped, suspended in the uncertain space between documented history and collective memory, between what can be proven and what is known without proof.